Over the last 2 centuries, thanks to movies and books and games and animation shows, samurais have become a legend who rule the land as almost a mythical version of Japan. But truth is, samurais were mostly tyrants who didn't even think twice before slicing a commoner in half. But that doesn't mean the samurai get to live a longer and healthier life than peasants. It was, in fact, full of hazards and perils. Welcome to Nutty History, and today let's find out why you wouldn't survive as a samurai in feudal Japan, and your dreams of being a legend will never be fulfilled. Peace was never an option. The biggest misconception about the word samurai is that it translates to the English word warrior. The word for warrior in Japanese is bushi. Samurai, on the other hand, is derived from the word saburo. No, not like the car. Saburo means one or those who serve. Even though the history of samurais can be traced back to the 13th century or before, the golden age of samurai began in the middle of the 15th century when the rise of the daimyo, or feudal lords, plunged Japan into political turmoil and wars. This warring lasted until 1600 CE and ended with Tokugawa vanquishing Ashita Mitsunari at the Battle of Sekiguhara. Under the Tokugawa dynasty, Japan and samurai both flourished for the next 250 years in peace. But you know what? Peace was never an option for a samurai. It just didn't fit their lifestyle. In fact, it would be better to define Bushido as a code of death rather than a code of living. When Buddhism spread across Japan's mainland, death in Japanese culture became institutionalized. The thing is, taking one's own life for their daimyo became the pinnacle display of loyalty in Japan, which even carried to modern militarism as supreme evidence of honor and devotion to duty. When Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced the country's surrender on the radio on September 2, 1945, many Japanese patriots took their lives in grief of the humiliation of their emperor.
世界の体制と帝国の現状とに鑑み、非常の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し。
It is believed that the people in authority during the period of feudal Japan manipulated the social image of death as a glorious salvaging end that would grant you peace that one cannot achieve during the tumultuous life in Japan. Life was for serving, and death was the deliverance. This romanticized propaganda of death also seeped into popular culture, from television to dramas and manga. Death was beautiful. Death was masculinity objectified. It's like that one song in Mulan about be a man, but it's all death. In these heavily idealized stories of Japan, taking one's own life was often portrayed as a macho thing to do, and was considered the richest ideology through the tragic ending. So yeah, samurai were restless folk who intentionally sought trouble, and it became harder to do so during the Edo Age. With no battlefields demanding blood, they started looking for it on the streets. A phrase that emerged during this time in Japan was Kaji to Kenka wa Edo no Hana, which means fires and fights are the flowers of Edo. Feudal to felonies. Today, Japan is considered one of the safest countries to live in when it comes to crime. But Japan is also the country with one of the biggest crime networks in the world. The Yakuza thrives and rules the underbelly of the archipelago. In 2001, there were 84,000 registered crime family members of Yakuza operating across Japan, and nearly 20 million copies of the games have been sold worldwide. What? We're not talking about games? But it's a good franchise. The Yakuza crime family controls legitimate businesses, but its bread and butter are loan sharking and gambling and adult entertainment. If you're wondering how the Yakuza spread its roots across Japan despite such intolerance towards crime, the answer leads us to the samurai. During the period of peace, samurai were prosperous, but also an unnecessary cog in the wheel of Japanese society. With little to do, they decided to begin wearing outlandish clothing. They had rebellious haircuts and started themed street gangs to terrify common folks and start gang wars against other similar groups, like in the movie Warrior. One of the most popular samurai street gangs was called Kabi Kimono. Just like the punk American street gangs of the 1980s, they created their own fashion statement, came up with their own slang words, and were infamous for their debauched behaviors. Apart from the flamboyant Kabukimono, Kyokaku was another street gang that made its presence a nuisance for the authorities. The two gangs often sparred and shed blood on the streets of Edo. Unlike Kabukimono members, who were high-class born kids, Kyokaku comprised of samurai and low-born alike. Kyokaku members could be identified by their shaved sideburns and the extra-long swords because at the end of the day, it was all about length measuring competition. Kyokaku also liked to portray themselves as vigilantes and protectors of people, but they were no better than other street gangs comprised of thugs. According to the book Musui's Story, the autobiography of Tokugawa samurai, the trend of these street gangs, or hatamoto yako, began with a Ronin who was banished by his master for indulging in criminal activities named Katsukokichi. But remember that samurai were never the honorable idealists as they are popularized today. In fact, Bushido, as we know today, has nothing to do with the code of Bushi that samurai followed back in the day. Dr. Henry Smith of Columbia University explains that original Bushido was just one of the assorted warrior guidelines in Japan's history, such as Suamono, Nomichi, Samuraido, and Bushi no Michi. Their values often do include things like fighting spirit, skill, duty, honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice, but they were more focused on different things, and by nature, quite martial.
As Bushido is the only code that has survived the time, or we should say that it has reinvented itself to not get lost to the oblivion of history, it has been popularized as the grand champion of the samurai tournament of the Universal Code of Ethics. The real reason behind that is when the Meiji Restoration happened and samurai became a thing of the past. Samurai warrior values steered the loyalty aspect from the samurai's immediate master to a more generalized appreciation of the emperor and nation.
Besides, Japan opening itself to the West allowed a cultural transaction of literature. Bushido soon became the Japanese equivalent to Western chivalry thanks to books like Notobi Inazo's 1899 book, Bushido, The Soul of Japan. And while the West perceives Bushido as the ultra-macho book of code for samurai, the samurai of the Edo period were known to wear outrageous attires including women's kimonos, bright-colored accessories, jewelry, even items from the West to loudly announce how much of a rebel without a cause they were. And that sort of trend to dress extravagantly passed on to the Yakuza as well. As more and more Ronin were banished from their clans, they started grouping up with the Tekiya. Like Ronin, Tekiya was also a group of outcasts who were considered non-humans and lower than the four-tiered Japanese feudal social structure. They were wandering peddlers who would travel from village to village, selling low-quality goods at festivals and markets. As Ronin reinforced Tekiya during the early years of the 18th century, the Tekiya were emboldened enough to start criminal activities like turf wars and protection rackets. With Meiji Restoration, some of these gangs fled to the highways and started indulging in gambling and identified themselves as Bakuto. After the Second World War weakened Japan, Yakuza found ways to spread across Japan and created strongholds for their territories. These gangs still follow a lot of customs from the days of the old, like fighting with katana swords. The risk of being Mrs. Samurai.
This YOLO attitude of samurai may romanticize them as ultimate warriors in pop culture, but as their family, things were quite hard. Being married to a samurai in itself was a horrid affair, even if you don't count their love for death. Most of the high society samurai marriages happen at a very young age, and without any agency of the bride and groom involved in the decision to wed them off.
Marriages of the Edo era were prearranged all across Japanese society, with parents having full control over who their children would marry. But the samurai class had it worse because they also needed the consent of domanial and shogunal authorities for the wedding to happen. The groom and bride were often strangers, meeting for the first time during their wedding. Not only did this system virtually eliminate the chances of love marriages to happen, but often led to tragic consequences of young samurai taking their lives when forced to marry someone else and not their one true love. Dowry was also predominant and a deciding factor in such marriages, but if the bride's family was poorer or did not belong to any samurai clan and was on a lower class family, the bride's family would have to pay the samurai to marry their daughter. You could imagine easily how loving and successful these marriages would have been. If married life was bad, somehow death as a wife of a samurai was worse.
When women learned of their husband's death, they would often perform jigai. Jigai was often performed to save one's integrity from the enemies of their husband. Unlike seppuku, which focused on a slow, agonizing death, jigai was meant to be quick and dignified.
Some women would also perform jigai to atone for bringing shame to their family and husband, but mostly it was performed immediately after hearing the news of their husband doing seppuku. Western Samurais.
In 1579, as a tall African man in Kyoto, his footsteps shook the entire system of samurai and Japanese culture as they knew it back then. The African man's birth name is lost to history, and most believe he was born in Mozambique. In Japan, everybody called him Yasuke. According to historian Lawrence Walker, His much different appearance from Japanese folks created quite a stir in Kyoto, as people would climb over one another at the risk of being crushed just to catch a glimpse of him. His popularity and uniqueness helped Yasuke to join the upper echelons of Japan's warrior class. Back in 1900, Japan's average height for men was only 5'2", and Yasuke, as mentioned by contemporary samurai, was 6'2". So he would have towered over most Japanese guys in the 16th century when malnutrition was more common in Japan. He also learned to speak Japanese fluently real fast and earned his place to ride with the first great unifier of Japan, Nobunaga, in battles. Now, if you're wondering how Yasuke found acceptance in a closed Japanese upper society, you have to give credit to Nobunaga. He already was known for changing Japanese warfare as it was known back then. Instead of elite warriors equipped with traditional weapons, Nobunaga's forces consisted of units called Ashugaru that fought under the command of more traditional samurai. The Ashugaru could be defined as half samurai, who were peasants and not nobilities and were equipped with spears and rifles while wearing little to nothing for armor. So it makes sense that Yasuke arrived in Japan with an Italian Jesuit named Alessandro Valignano on an inspection tour. Nobunaga would have liked the hulking man towering over the common populace and nobility to join his army. But that doesn't mean Nobunaga acquired Yasuke from the Italian Jesuit. Although some historians like to believe Yasuke was a servant, most consider otherwise. And though Yasuke must have been trained as a warrior before arriving in Japan, it is said that Nobunaga was more impressed by his conversational skills. Yasuke perhaps already knew Japanese a bit, and the two men got along well. Nobunaga was impressed by Yasuke's tales of Africa and India, and unlike Jesuits, Yasuke had no agenda behind his visit to Japan. The warfare is where the two men later would bond more, as both men were great fans of martial arts and spent a lot of time practicing together. Also, Nobunaga in general was more accepting of the foreign culture, unlike Tokugawa. This created the precedent of allowing foreign-born people to earn the respect of samurai and become one themselves. The Tokugawa were mostly against foreign interference in the affairs of Japan, but they too had a foreign samurai in their ranks. One of the first Dutch-French officers to visit Japan was a man named Jan Joosten van Lodenstein, who was given the rank of Haramoto under the Tokugawa shogunate, and he chartered several Red Seal ships for them. English navigator William Adams, Shimatsu Ihaisa, a political refugee from China, Italian Jesuit Giuseppe Chiara, and Prussian soldier Henry Snells also succeeded to infiltrate Japan and become samurai. And to end this list, Jules Brunet was most likely the inspiration behind the movie The Last Samurai. Now, it's believed that Yasuke was present in Nobunaga's fortress on the fateful night when Akechi Mitsuhide, one of Nobunaga's trusted generals, turned on the warlord and trapped him in a room with fire. Some say Yasuke was with Nobunaga when the warlord realized he couldn't escape his fate. The warlord asked Yasuke to behead him to save him from burning alive. Think about that for a second. Wow, imagine your best friend asking you to do that. In Japanese culture, this was a sign of great trust, and Nobunaga wanted Yasuke to be the one to deliver the news of his demise to his son by bringing his head to him. But it is generally accepted that Yasuke may have not accepted this request, and Nobunaga died after performing seppuku. The legend of Yakuza came to an end shortly after this in 1582. The fall of Nobunaga at the hands of a treacherous general resulted in the exile of the first black samurai, possibly back to a Jesuit mission in Kyoto. But speaking of seppuku, we need to address the most humiliating way samurais were eliminated. The ritual of Honorary self-death. Seppuku, often called harakiri in the West, or as memers like to refer to it, Sudoko, was the ritual to take one's own life among the samurai warrior class. The ritual was pretty simple. Point your katana or short sword towards oneself and puncture it in one's guts, followed by separating the stomach open. Anyone else grabbing their stomach right now? Ooh. This gruesome act required a lot of will and strength to perform and resulted in a slow, painful death. While many chose to accept this fate and endure the pain for as long as it was meant to last, others chose to enlist the aid of kaishukunen, or second, to finish them off quickly by removing their head and putting them out of their misery. By the way, there is a difference between the word seppuku and harakiri. Seppuku means taking one's own life, and harakiri is the act of opening one's own stomach. So you can say seppuku was the ritual and harakiri was the act performed to complete the ritual. Most of the time, this ritual was accompanied by a grand ceremony where the samurai committing seppuku, or the ones that ordered them to do so, would invite other samurais to witness the rite. The samurai who had an artistic soul would also compose their own eulogy in the form of a short death poem and drink sake before submitting themselves to their blade. So the origins of this ritual go as far back as the 12th century, and it was always meant to be the samurai's means to achieve an honorable death. Many did it to avoid being captured by the enemy on the battlefield and avoid the shame of surrendering, while others performed it as a way to show protest against their overlords or to express grief over the death of a revered leader. As a samurai, life without a master was a whole other Pandora's box of challenges, but we'll talk about that later. Seppuku wasn't used as a capital punishment until the 15th century for samurai who were found guilty of breaking the law. And yes, they were above the law, but there were a few exceptions, like treason. But the general perception of seppuku remained the same even after it became a form of punishment and humility. In fact, samurai were so prepared for death all the time that they lived every day as their last and prepared accordingly. They would burn incense in their helmets so their heads wouldn't smell if lopped off. Wonder how they avoided hair fires. The Ronin. A samurai's life mostly revolved around their masters. So if they lost their master before completing their training, a samurai without full training was no better than a fake coin. Thanks to magical folktales like 47 Ronin, a Ronin or masterless samurai are often glamorized in pop culture, with Samurai Jack being the most famous example. But in real history, no samurai ever wanted to be degraded to Ronin. Japanese society had a ridiculed perception of Ronin. That means these wandering samurai still treated people poorly, but because they had no clans backing them, the general public also treated them no better than hobos. More often than not, these Ronin made things even worse for themselves by not giving up their samurai pride and refusing to work normal jobs. This usually plunged them into poverty and homelessness, and they most likely passed away in the wild or on the streets. Armor and Armory. Clad in colorful armors, donning unique and iconic helmets called kabuto, faces covered by a ferocious mark called menpo, and often riding a horse, samurai have carved their own distinct etchings in the sands of time. But that stereotypical look of a samurai wasn't the only way a samurai dressed for their battles and duties. As samurai were often bloodthirsty to get into battle, armor was crucial for them to stay safe and alive. But despite popular assumptions, Japanese samurai never used bamboo or wood in their armor crafting. Their armor was mostly built from leather, iron, steel, wool, and even cotton. If a samurai was highly prestigious, they would like to have silk used in their armor crafting as well. Well, la-di-da-di. The ornament work was mostly done with gold and other precious metals. Kozane, or the lacquered iron and leather scales, were the base item for crafting samurai armor. Kozane was attached to a male backing called a kusari, which then would be stitched onto a leather or cloth surface. This bright color of this outer surface was derived from odoshi, the lacing that held the kozane together. Only very rich samurai were able to afford odoshi. The samurai armor found itself in need of evolution when firearms became common in Japanese warfare during the 16th century. The breastplate, called the do, had to give way for plate armor. The classic form of samurai armor, however, was the oyoroi. It was an ornate design, but also a boxy-looking suit. The do was a centerpiece and covered the left, front, and back of the torso. The right side was covered by a plate called the waidate. The hip and loin guarding skirt was called kusazuri, hung from the do and protected the thighs. Gotta protect those thighs. The protection to the left side of the body was seen as quite important in the samurai armors because of how archery was done in feudal Japan. The archers would lose arrows to the left, and that is why samurai wore armor that was loose-fitting. So in case of arrow penetration, there would be an empty space between the armor and the torso, protecting the samurai from grievous injuries. As archery was the prevalent form of artillery in the Heian period, a lot of stress in samurai armor design was on deflecting arrows or making them less effective and making samurai archers more convenient. The shoulder patty, sode, used to be a lot bigger back then and hung more toward the back to stay out of the way of the bowstring. And the arrows would come in and it'd get stopped between the padding and the body. While oyoroi armor continued to stay popular among wealthy samurai overlords in the Kamakura period, the not-so-financially able samurais began using the dumaru armor, which was a lighter, compact version of oyoroi. Unlike the older armor design, the dumaru was more form-fitting and comfortable. The difference between the weight of the two armors was nearly 10 kilograms. The do in dumaru consisted of a single piece that could be hinged under the right armpit. It rested more on the hips and allowed more freedom of movement, which was vital for survival in close combat. As peace came along with the Tokugawa regime in the Edo period,
Bulky battlefield-appropriate armor fell out of favor, and fashion began to dictate what samurai armor should look like. The trend was to wear lightweight, easily concealed attire for protection, and a brigandine, kiko, composed of many small hexagonal iron plates sewn onto cloth, came into popularity. Samurai also made their armors look distinct to represent their clan heraldry called mon. The mon were motifs that could be as simple as abstract patterns or shapes, depictions of flowers or vines, or they may represent kanji, depicting a motto. Though in the Western world, colors were strongly associated with noble families and heraldry, Japan didn't care much about colors.
But samurai was supposed to wear a banner carrying their lord's crest on the back of their armor in battle. Now, if you've played the Legend of Zelda games, you must be familiar with the Triforce symbol. This arrangement of 3 smaller triangles forming a larger one was originally the mon of the Hojo family.
Despite appearing big and yet offering a lot of mobility, samurai armor looks like a perfect design, but the reality was far from it. As samurai armor were made of lots of joints and attachments to make them more efficient and mobile, they also were the biggest vulnerability in the armors as well. The archaeological studies of skeletons of fallen samurai have shown that when fighting reached the sword range, that's when samurai armor became a bit of a liability, as sword cuts aimed at the juncture between the neck and shoulder were often lethal and easily ignored to protection. The lacing was pretty much the Achilles heel of the armor, as one cut on the lacing was enough to compromise the integrity of the armor. This was the biggest reason why armorers in later centuries switched to rivets to connect pieces and rejected lacings. And though often pop culture media like to portray samurai warriors as these hulking brutes with heavily spiked maces, the samurai armor design had less thought put into it when it comes to bludgeoning damage.
Samurai armors could withstand spears and polearms, swords, and arrows aplenty, but give the man a sheer blunt weapon and he could make any samurai in the world sweat.
The Last Stand. There were many reasons why the samurai had become obsolete during the 19th century. The isolation from the outside world had left the shogunate pretty outdated in terms of military techniques. Besides, the Tokugawa dynasty's push towards stoic attitudes across all Japanese classes resulted in people abandoning money and embracing poverty, leading to the overall decline of the Japanese economy and the samurai losing their hold over people.
However, historian Kozo Yamamura doesn't outright debunk the concept of the impoverished Edo samurai, but states that the increasing poverty could have been due to any number of economic reasons. He mentions that samurai may have been left behind because other classes' wealth rose faster than that of the samurai class, to psychological poverty, where the samurai grew so accustomed to their power and wealth that their expectations for income rose higher than their actual income.
Famine, poverty, the incursion of Western powers into Japan, and a weak regime created an overall environment of unrest, and the warrant for the ruling class of samurai was out. When samurai revolted against the international treaties to allow foreigners to trade in Japan, they were so out of depth that they didn't even know the music that was playing was for them. The Japanese feudal system and samurai clans sang their swan song on a battlefield near Kagoshima on September 25, 1877. Only the Satsuma clan samurai and their leader Saigo Takamori remained, and Saigo's initial attempts only ended up escalating violence. Saigo and his 500 men faced 30,000 soldiers sent by the government with no supplies or ammunition. They had to melt trinkets and cutlery to forge bullets, and there was only a carpenter's saw and some filthy rags in the name of medical supplies. As soon as the government army launched the assault with artillery fire, Saigo knew the samurai had seen their last sunrise. He resigned to his fate after a final drink of sake with his dearest friends. 3 hours after the Imperials stormed the samurai front, only 40 samurai were left alive, with Saigo mortally wounded. He managed to get to the hilltop with his follower Shinsuke, who beheaded him to complete his seppuku. Then remaining samurai charged the battlefield, only to die gloriously or pathetically, depending on how you see it.
All things must come to an end, and samurai were no different. They lived carrying their hearts on their sleeve, and time eventually humbled their pride. Thanks for watching Nutty History. If you enjoyed the video, leave us a like and share it. Also, please subscribe to support us and catch more nutty pieces of history in the future.